Turn to page number 28, where we're starting in Bridge of Blood. And thank you so much for being here at Tabernacle Baptist Church for our Sunday school time. We already, in number 4 at the top of the page, went over the paragraph dealing with John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation, the one that was possibly the first and brightest voice at the beginning of the Reformation, and bringing to light some of the problems that were in the Catholic Church. And even though he died a natural death, the Catholic Church hated him so much they dug up his bones and burned his bones. I guess they thought that maybe if they did that, he couldn't have part in the resurrection or something like that, which I guess still goes to show about the erroneous nature of false doctrine. If we go to number 5, we'll start here. Following tolerably close to the heels of Wycliffe came John Huss, 1373 to 1415, a distinguished son from faraway Bohemia. His soul had felt and responded to the brilliant light of England's morning star. His was a brave and eventful life, but painfully and sadly short. Instead of awakening a responsive chord among the Catholic people in favor of real reformation, he roused the fear and hatred and opposition which resulted in his being burned at the stake, a martyr among his own people. And yet he was seeking their own good. He loved his Lord and he loved his people. However, he was only one of many millions who had thus to die. Number 6, next to John Huss of Bohemia came a wonderful son of Italy, the marvelously eloquent Savonarola in 1452 to 1498. Huss was burned in 1415. Savonarola was born 37 years later. He, like Huss, was a devout Catholic, found the leaders of his people, the people of Italy, like those of Bohemia, against all reformation. But he, by his mighty eloquence, succeeded in awakening some conscience and securing a considerable following. But a real reformation in the hierarchy meant absolute ruin of the higher ups in that organization. So Savonarola was, as well as Huss, must die. He too was burned at the stake. Of all the eloquent men of that great period, Savonarola possibly stood head and shoulders above the others. But he was contending against a mighty organization, and their existence demanded that they fight the Reformation, so Savonarola must die. Now, notice here, as we're dealing with this, we're dealing with men, and you say, well, the focus is on the power of the Catholic Church, but look at this. These men who stood up for the right, these men who talked about biblical things, and they would have, as they stood up for the things of the Bible, they would have, as we'll see just a little bit later, they would have the support of those that were the Anabaptists, those that had never gone into the Catholic Church, so they'd never have to reform to get out of the Catholic Church. These were people that suffered persecutions all along the way, as we've seen in past pages of the book. Number 7, of course, in giving the names of the reformers of this period, many names are necessarily to be left out. Only those most frequently referred to in history are mentioned here. Following Italy's golden-tongued orator came the man from Switzerland, Zwingli. Zwingli was born before Savonarola died. He lived from 1484 to 1531. The spirit of Reformation was beginning now to fill the whole land. Its fires were now breaking out faster and spreading more rapidly and becoming most difficult to control. This one kindled by Zwingli was not yet more than a partially smothered before another, more serious than all the rest, had broken out in Germany. Zwingli died in battle. Number 8, Martin Luther, probably the most noted of all the 15th and 16th century reformers, lived from 1483 to 1546, and as can be seen by the dates, was very nearly an exact contemporary of Zwingli. He was born 1 year earlier and lived 15 years later. Far more, probably, than history definitely states, his great predecessors have in great measure been easier, have made his way easier, have in great measure made easier his hard way before him. And I'll get that right. Furthermore, he learned from their hard experience, and then later and most thoroughly from his own, that a genuine reformation inside the Catholic Church would be utter impossibility. Too many reform measures would be needed. One would demand another, and others demand yet others, and so on and on. Number 9 there at the bottom, page 29. So Martin Luther, after many hard-fought battles with the leaders of Catholicism and aided by Melanchthon and other prominent Germans, became the founder in 1533 or about then of an entirely new Christian organization, now known as the Lutheran Church, which very soon became the Church of Germany. This was the first of the new organizations to come directly out of Rome and renounce all allegiance to the Catholic Mother Church, as she was called, and to continue to live hereafter. Number 10 at the very bottom of page 29, skipping now for a little while, the Church of England, which comes next to the Lutheran in its beginnings. We will follow for a little while the Reformation on the continent from 1509 to 1564. There lived another and of the greatest of the reformers. This is John Calvin, a Frenchman, but seeming at the time to be living in Switzerland. He was really a mighty man. He was contemporary to Martin Luther for 30 years and was 22 years old when Zwingli died. Calvin is the accredited founder of the Presbyterian Church. Some of the historians, however, give the credit to Zwingli, but the strongest evidence seems to be in favor of Calvin. Unquestionably, the work of Zwingli, as well as that of Luther, made much easier the work of Calvin. So in 1541, just 11 years, that seems to be the year, after founding by Luther of the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church came into existence. It too, as in the case of Lutherans, was led by a Reformed Catholic priest, or at least an official. These 6, Wycliffe, Huss, Savonarola, Zwingli, Luther, and Calvin, great leaders in their great battles for Reformation, struck Catholicism a staggering blow. Now, in 1560, 19 years after Calvin's first organization in Geneva, Switzerland, John Knox, a disciple of Calvin, established the first Presbyterian church in Scotland. And just 32 years later, in 1592, the Presbyterian became the state church of Scotland. During all these hard struggles for Reformation, continuous and valuable aid was given to the reformers by many Anabaptists, or whatever other name they bore, hoping for some relief from their own bitter lot. They came out of their hiding places and fought bravely with the reformers, but they were doomed to fearful disappointment. They were from now on to have an additional persecuting enemies. Both the Lutheran and Presbyterian churches brought out of their Catholic mother many of their evils, or many of her evils, among them her idea of a state church. They both soon became established churches. Both were soon in the persecuting business, falling little, if any, short of their Catholic mother. So here we have the Anabaptists still following in persecution, coming alongside the Reformation, those that have come out, but then realizing as they did, these organizations became state churches linked with the local government, and again the tables were turned against the Anabaptists, who would be called at a later time the Baptists. Let's go on to the trail of blood at the bottom of page number 30. Sad and awful was the fate of these long-suffering Anabaptists. The world now offered no sure place for hiding. 4 hard persecutors were now hot on their trail. Surely theirs was a trail of blood. Number 13 at the bottom of the page. During the same period, really early by several years than the Presbyterians, arose yet another new denomination, not on the continent, but in England. However, this came about not so much by way of Reformation, though that evidently made it easier, as by a way of real split or division in the Catholic ranks. More like the division of 869, when Eastern Catholics separated from the Western and became, from that time on, known in history as the Greek and Roman Catholic churches. This new division came about somewhat on this wise. England's king, Henry VIII, was married to Catherine of Spain, but unfortunately, after some time, his somewhat troublesome heart had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. So he wanted to divorce Catherine and marry Annie. Getting a divorce back then was no easy matter. Only the Pope could grant it, and he, in this case, for special reasons, declined to grant it. Henry was in a great distress, being king. He felt he ought to be entitled to follow his own will in the matter. His prime minister, at that time Thomas Cromwell, rather made sport of the king. Why do you submit to papal authority on such matters? Henry followed his suggestion, threw off the papal authority, and made himself head of the Church of England. Thus began the new Church of England. This was consummated in 1534, 1535. At that time, there was no change in doctrine, simply a renunciation of the authority of the Pope. Henry, at heart, really never became a Protestant. He died in the Catholic faith. Number 14. But this split did ultimately result in some very considerable change in Reformation. While the Reformation within the Catholic Church and under papal authority, as in the case of Luther and others, was impossible, it became possible after the division. Cranmer, Latimer, Ridley, and others led some marked changes. However, they and many others paid a bloody price for the changes when a few years later, Mary, also known as Bloody Mary, a daughter of divorced Catherine, came to the English throne. She carried the new church back under papal power. This fearful and terrific reaction ended in the strenuous and bloody 5-year reign of Mary. While the heads were going under the bloody axe of Mary, hers went with them. The people had gotten, however, a partial taste of freedom. So when Elizabeth had gotten, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, for whom Catherine was divorced, became queen, the Church of England again overthrew the papal power and was again reestablished. Number 15 at the bottom of page 31. Thus, before the close of the 16th century, there were 5 established churches backed by civil government. The Roman and Greek Catholics counted as 2. Then the Church of England, then the Lutheran, or the Church of Germany, and then the Church of Scotland, now known as the Presbyterian. All of them were bitter in their hatred and persecution of people called Anabaptists. Waldenses and all other non-established churches which never in any way had been connected with the Catholics, their great help in the struggle for Reformation had been forgotten or was wholly ignored. Many more thousands, including both women and children, were constantly perishing every day in the yet unending persecution. The great hope, awakened and inspired by the Reformation, had proven to be a bloody delusion. Remnants now find an uncertain refuge in friendly Alps and other hiding places over the world. Number 16. These three organizations, separating from and coming out of Catholics, retain many of the most hurtful errors, some of which are as follows. Now we're going to stop there just for a second. We want to go back. There's a mention of John Calvin on top of page 30. And he was a powerful man, and he was a ruler, and he did reign in where he was in Switzerland, where he was. But there's one evident thing that we need to remember. There are some that have tried to tell us that Calvin and his teachings, Calvinism, have always been a part of the Baptist Church. But John Calvin came out of the Catholic Church with many of the Catholic teachings. And so he was not a part of the Anabaptist movement. He was not a part of those that never were in the Catholic Church, but he came out. And as such, also there were some dealings with persecution that he himself placed on those that did not agree with him. If you disagreed with John Calvin, there is a possibility that you might not be living for very much longer. But now let's go back to page number 32. I just wanted to point that out, that John Calvin was never a part of the Anabaptist movement, never a part of the modern, of the Anabaptist movement that became the Baptist Church. Now there are some that have adopted the Baptist name to the Reformation that was brought out of the Catholic Church by John Calvin. But again, there are a lot of things that have been brought out of the Catholic Church by these. And here's some of them on page number 32 under 16. Number 1, preacher, church, government, differing in form. Church establishment, church and state combination. Infant baptism, now that's a key, that you can be baptized as an infant and count that as salvation. Sprinkling or pouring for baptism, and also baptismal regeneration, which is linked with infant baptism. That if you get sprinkled or poured, that's salvation. You don't need anything else. Some at least, and others, if many of their historians are to be accredited. Number 6, the persecuting of others, and that's for centuries. Number 17 under that. In the beginning of all these established churches, persecuted one another as well as everyone else. But the council held at Augsburg in 1555 a treaty of peace known as the Peace of Augsburg was signed between the Catholics on one hand and the Lutherans on the other, agreeing not to persecute each other. You let us alone, and we will let you alone. For Catholics to fight Lutherans meant war with Germany, and for Lutherans to fight and persecute Catholics meant a war with all the countries where Catholicism predominated. So we find here that there was peace, but not towards those who believe the Bible, just the established churches who said you have to be a part of our group in order to be saved. Now you notice these Protestant churches are splintering. And yet they all claim to be the authority over the Bible. Let's go down, and of course, especially with the Lutheran Church and some of the others, there were those that were trying to get a foothold back in the Bible, but they brought some of the poison out with them as they were protesting against the teaching of the Catholic Church, bringing enough out with them so that they still were having problems with the truth. Now, there is God still dealing with his word. But now let's go down to bottom page 32, number 18, a trail of blood. But persecutions did not then cease. The hated Anabaptists, called Baptists today, in spite of all prior persecutions and in spite of the awful fact, that 50 million had already died martyr death, still existed in great numbers. It was during this period that along one of the single European highway, 30 miles distance, stakes were set up every few feet along the highway. The tops of the stakes sharpened, and on the top of each stake was placed the gory head of a martyred Anabaptist. Human imagination can hardly picture a scene so awful, and yet a thing perpetrated according to the reliable history by people calling themselves devout followers of the meek and lowly Jesus Christ. What was Jesus' proclamation? Go into all the world and teach and preach the gospel. These who were Protestant, these who were Catholic, all had gone after the Anabaptists and said, because you will follow Jesus and not us, you must die. Number 19, let it be remembered that the Catholics do not regard the Bible as the sole rule or guide of faith and life. They claim that it is indeed unerring, but there are two other things just as much so: the writings of the fathers and the decrees of the church, the Catholic Church, or the declarations of the infallible Pope. Now, you notice the word that goes along with Pope, infallible. Anything he says is right, at least according to the church. Hence, there can never be a satisfactory debate between Catholic and Protestant, or between Catholic and Baptist, as there could never possibly be a basis of final agreement. The Bible alone can never settle anything so far as the Catholics are concerned. Let's go down just to number 20. We'll read a sentence here. Take, for example, the question of baptism and the final authority for the act and for the mode. They claim that the Bible unquestionably teaches baptism and that it teaches immersion as the only mode. But they claim at the same time that their unerring church had the perfect right to change the mode from immersion to sprinkling, but that no others have that right or authority, none but the infallible papal authority. So I have the right to change it, even though it's Bible, but you don't have the right to change it because you're not me. How about that? Oh, me. You can see where that has led, and the problem, we're going to stop there on 20. We may go back to 20 before we hit number 21, but we'll come back to that, Lord willing, next week.